The air had stopped moving hours before. Not the kind of stillness that comes between wind gusts, something more complete than that. A man standing post in the dark learns to read the desert the way a sailor reads water. He knows what absence sounds like. He knows what normal quiet feels like against his skin. This was not that. The soldier's hand moved to his rifle before he understood why. The motion came from somewhere below conscious thought, from a part of the nervous system that predates language. He had been staring at the same stretch of ground for 4 hours. He knew its contours. He had memorized the way pale rock caught starlight along the ridge at approximately 200 meters. He knew where the shadows pooled and where they did not. The shadow in the depression near the northwestern marker had not been there an hour ago. He watched it for 11 minutes without moving. He would say later, much later, and only once, that what unsettled him most was not the shape itself. It was that the shape did not shift when the wind returned. Everything else moved. The shape did not. By morning, he said nothing. He signed his post log. He ate his breakfast. He did not bring it up for 3 weeks. He was not the first to see it. He would not be the last. If you find value in long-form historical documentary storytelling, the kind that takes time, takes research, and takes seriously the experiences of the people who live these events, consider subscribing. It helps this work continue. The desert has always been a place of contested sovereignty, long before modern armies drew operational boundaries across its face. Empires measured their ambitions against its distances and failed. The Romans understood this. So did the Ottomans. So did every colonial administrator who looked at a topographical map and believed that lines on paper translated into control of the ground. By the early years of the 21st century, American military forces had established a network of forward operating bases and combat outposts throughout the highland desert terrain of Afghanistan and the low flatland desert of Iraq. The outposts in particular, smaller, more remote, often positioned for surveillance rather than force projection, were designed to maintain a persistent presence in areas where the larger infrastructure of military power could not easily reach. The terrain demanded a specific kind of attention. In the high desert of eastern Afghanistan, elevations frequently exceeded 7,000 feet. The air was thinner. Cold arrived without gradual transition. Temperatures could fall 40 degrees between midday and midnight. The ground was stony and pale, broken by shallow ravines and rock formations that cast unpredictable shadows when the moon was partial or low. In Iraq's western Anbar province, the landscape shifted to a flatter, more open geometry. Vast stretches of empty ground surrounded coalition positions. Visibility could extend for miles on a clear day, but at night, under cloud cover or during the lunar dark, that same openness became something else entirely. Distance collapsed. Perception became unreliable. Soldiers stationed at these outposts operated on rotation schedules designed to maintain coverage across all hours. Guard duty was assigned in 2 to 4 hour blocks, cycling through a small number of available personnel. In smaller outposts, this meant the same 4 to 8 soldiers sharing watch responsibilities across a 24-hour period, night after night, for deployment cycles that frequently exceeded 6 months. Military records from these outposts are thorough in some areas and notably sparse in others. Patrol logs document activity, contact, and observation. What they document less consistently, and in many cases not at all, is the informal record of what soldiers said to each other after dark. Official records do not fully match lived experience. It is difficult to establish when the reports began because they did not begin as reports. They began as private observations, the kind of thing a soldier might mention quietly to the man who relieved him at post, or say nothing about at all. Veterans who served at remote outposts in both Iraq and Afghanistan have described, in interviews conducted years after their service, a recurring experience associated with nighttime guard duty. The accounts differ in detail. They come from different branches, different units, different wars. but they share enough structural similarity that researchers studying combat psychology have begun cataloging them as a coherent pattern rather than isolated incidents. The core of the reported experience is consistent. A soldier on solitary night watch becomes aware of a figure at the periphery of their observation area. The figure is described as human in rough silhouette, observed at distances ranging from 100 to 300 meters. It is not advancing, not retreating, not raising a weapon. It is simply present. What soldiers recall with particular consistency is not the initial sighting, but the behavior that follows. The figure does not respond to challenge. It does not respond to movement by the observer. In several accounts, thermal optics returned inconsistent readings. Some soldiers describing a figure clearly visible to the naked eye that produced no thermal signature, and others describing the opposite, a strong thermal return with no visible source. These accounts were not shared publicly. They circulated within small groups. Some veterans described hearing the same description from men in their unit before they had experienced anything themselves. Others encountered the accounts only after the fact, when they mentioned their own experience and were told quietly that they were not the first. Similar observations were recorded across unrelated groups. What soldiers described, taken as a composite of available accounts, is an entity that behaves according to a recognizable set of parameters. It appears at night. It appears most frequently during the final hours of a watch, typically between 2 and 4 in the morning, when alertness is at its biological low point. It maintains distance. It does not initiate contact. Those who reported seeing it described a stillness they consistently characterized as unnatural, not the stillness of someone hiding, not the stillness of someone who has frozen because they have been seen, something more like the stillness of an object that has never moved and does not need to. The cultural context is not irrelevant. Both Afghanistan and Iraq have deep indigenous traditions of spirit entities associated with arid, liminal landscapes. In Islamic theology and folk tradition, the jinn are understood not as mythological constructs, but as a parallel category of being, real, present, and occasionally encountered. American soldiers stationed in these regions were, to varying degrees, aware of local beliefs, often through interaction with interpreters who spoke of such things plainly, without embarrassment. Several veterans recalled being told by local partners, Afghan National Army soldiers, Iraqi police, civilian interpreters, that certain locations had reputations, that certain outposts had been built on ground that was known, locally, as a place where things were seen. The pattern of the figure's behavior suggests a phenomenon with definable limits. It appears, it persists, it does not act. It is associated with specific locations rather than individuals. When units rotated out and new units arrived, reports from the same physical location continued. One detail does not fit any proposed explanation cleanly. In multiple unrelated accounts, soldiers described the figure as being visible for a sustained period and then simply absent, not retreating, not obscured by terrain, present and then not present, without any observed transition between those two states. No explanation accounts for this particular detail in a way that survives scrutiny. The practice of soldiers reporting unusual encounters at isolated posts did not begin in the modern wars. It has a longer history, and some of the earliest formally documented accounts come from American military personnel stationed during the Philippine-American War at the turn of the 20th century. Another conflict fought across unfamiliar terrain in a climate radically different from what most American soldiers had previously experienced. One account, preserved in the personal letters of an infantry soldier and later cited in a regimental history published in the 1940s, describes a sentry stationed at a small garrison post in the hill country of Luzon. The soldier had been at the post for approximately 3 months. His commanding officer had noted him positively in duty logs on more than one occasion. The soldier wrote to his brother that he had begun to see a figure standing at the edge of the tree line opposite the eastern wall of the post. He wrote that the figure stood in the same position on multiple nights. He had, on 2 occasions, reported a potential infiltrator to his sergeant, and on both occasions, a search of the area found nothing. After the second search, he said nothing further because he had no new information to offer and did not wish to be thought unreliable. The figure, he wrote, did not move. It was simply there, in the same place, the same way, until at some point during the watch it was not. His brother evidently asked whether he had been frightened. The response letter survives. He wrote that frightened was not quite the right word. He wrote that there is a specific feeling that comes when you are being observed. Most soldiers come to know it, and that what the figure produced in him was not quite that feeling, but something adjacent to it, something he could not name. He stopped writing about it after that letter. He returned home. He lived another 40 years. He apparently never discussed the matter publicly. The consequences were not dramatic. No incident, no confrontation. He came home, and he was quiet about certain things. The scientific literature on combat stress and sensory experience under deprivation conditions is extensive. After approximately 72 hours of disrupted sleep, the human brain begins to generate experiences perceptually indistinguishable from external events. Figures, voices, movement. The brain, deprived of sufficient restorative processing, begins to hallucinate, not as metaphor, but as a measurable failure of the perceptual system to accurately calibrate between internally generated and externally sourced information. This is a serious consideration. It is not offered to dismiss the soldiers who reported these experiences. It is offered because it is true. Isolation compounds the effect. Soldiers at small outposts operate in an environment of profound social and informational compression. The same people, the same views, the same sounds, repeated with minimal variation across a deployment lasting 7 or 8 months. The human brain is not designed for this. When these inputs are removed, the brain compensates. It finds patterns. It imposes meaning. It generates experience. Hypervigilance distorts perception in a specific direction. It makes the observer more likely, not less, to detect potential threats. In practical terms, a soldier on night watch is neurologically primed to perceive figures and presence, because the consequences of failing to detect a real threat are catastrophic. Desert rock formations cast shadows that shift with the moon's passage. Temperature inversions in arid environments produce light-bending atmospheric effects. Certain conditions produce visual distortions after dark that have been documented and measured. These factors, taken together, account for a substantial portion of reported experiences. Researchers who have reviewed available accounts have made this point consistently, and they are correct to make it. These factors explain many reports, but not all of them. A former Army infantryman who served multiple combat deployments to Afghanistan and spoke with researchers on the condition that his name not be used, described the following experience. He had been on deployment for approximately 4 months. He was not, by his own characterization, a superstitious person. He had pulled the 0200 to 0400 watch. The outpost was small. The night was cold and clear. There was no moon. He described watching the eastern sector for approximately 90 minutes without incident, noting the specific quality of his alertness at that hour. Not sleepy, quiet, a different state than wakefulness during the day. At approximately 0330, he became aware that something in the eastern sector had changed. He spent several minutes trying to identify what was different. Then he saw the figure. It was standing at the base of the ridge, approximately 180 meters out, clearly human in shape, upright, no visible equipment, no visible weapon. He reached for his radio. The outpost logs for that period, reviewed by researchers, contain no record of an incident or contact report for that night. He did not call it in. He said later that the figure produced in him a specific response he associated with encounters with civilians, a sense of non-threat, rather than the response he associated with enemy contact. He said this did not make rational sense to him, but it was accurate. He watched the figure for what he estimated as approximately 7 minutes. He did not challenge. He did not raise his weapon. He simply watched. Then there was a period. He paused for a long time before describing this, during which he was not certain what he was looking at, or whether he was looking at anything. It was not that the figure moved or left. It was more that the area at the base of the ridge gradually became simply the base of the ridge again, as if he had missed a transition. He was certain he had not looked away. When his relief arrived at 0400, he said nothing. He went inside and did not sleep. Approximately 2 weeks later, the soldier who had relieved him that night brought it up first. A Marine veteran who served in Anbar province described pulling watch at a vehicle checkpoint position approximately 30 kilometers from the nearest significant coalition installation. He saw a figure standing at the edge of the road at roughly 200 meters on 3 separate nights over 2 weeks. He reported it twice through official channels. Both reports resulted in searches that found no evidence of a person or recent foot traffic. A soldier from a specialized reconnaissance unit in Afghanistan described not a visible figure, but a persistent sound, slow, rhythmic, heard on multiple nights from the same direction, that he and other members of his element had attempted to locate without success. He mentioned this in the context of visual sightings because, he said, the response the sound produced in him was identical to what others described upon seeing the figure. A specific kind of attentiveness, a specific kind of waiting. A Vietnam veteran, now in his late 70s, described an experience during long-range reconnaissance operations in the Central Highlands. Dense canopy, a small cleared area, a position occupied for 2 nights. A figure at the tree line on the second night, visible for an extended period, that did not respond to challenge and was not found in subsequent search. He and his element discussed it among themselves that night. They did not include it in their after-action report. Across these accounts, the consistencies are specific. The distance is never very close, always at the useful edge of observation. The figure is never aggressive. It is stationary, and the decision not to report through official channels is remarkably common, even among soldiers who were by all accounts responsible and disciplined. The most immediate explanation is misidentification. Desert terrain at night contains forms that approximate human silhouettes, rock formations, brush, physical features of the ground that catch light in ways the eye interprets as upright figures. The eye is pattern-seeking, and especially so when trained to look for human presence. Under low-light conditions, with the additional distorting factors of thermal shimmer and progressive fatigue, the rate of misidentification is measurably elevated. This explanation accounts for many reported sightings. It almost certainly accounts for some. What it does not account for fully is duration. A misidentified rock formation remains a rock formation. Several veterans described returning to the relevant area the following day and finding nothing that corresponded to what they had seen. Not a rock, not a formation. The area was simply empty ground. The psychological explanation, stress-induced hallucination, hypnagogic imagery during microsleep, hypervigilant pattern recognition, is more robust. It accounts for timing, emotional quality, and the selection pressure toward human figures. It is a genuinely powerful framework. What it does not resolve is the multi-witness dimension. In several accounts, more than one soldier reported seeing the same thing at the same location, sometimes on the same night. Independent hallucinations producing identical content are not impossible, but they require an additional explanatory layer that the simple fatigue model does not comfortably provide. The environmental explanation, atmospheric optics, light refraction, temperature-based visual distortions, is technically relevant. These effects are real and documented. What it does not cleanly address is the zero thermal signature problem. If a figure is the product of atmospheric projection, it is projecting something that should produce a detectable return. Several accounts describe a visual figure with no corresponding thermal reading. Atmospheric projection does not explain the absence of a heat source. Each explanation almost works. This account was provided over 2 separate conversations, approximately 6 weeks apart. The individual is a veteran who served at a small combat outpost in eastern Afghanistan during a deployment that ended in 2011. He was a staff sergeant at the time. He had been in the Army for 9 years. He was not on his first deployment. The outpost had a consistent problem with the northwestern approach. He used that phrase before specifying what he meant. Beginning approximately 6 weeks into their occupancy, soldiers pulling the northwestern post at night began coming off watch in a condition he noticed as a pattern. They were not visibly distressed. They were quiet. He said there is a particular kind of quiet that combat soldiers recognize in each other. Not the quiet of someone tired or bored, but the quiet of someone processing. He began rotating himself into the northwestern post deliberately. On the first night, nothing occurred. He noted the terrain carefully, a shallow slope, approximately 250 meters of open ground before a series of low rocky formations. He cataloged 2 potential misidentification risks: a pale rock at roughly 160 meters with a vertical profile in certain light, and a shallow depression at approximately 200 meters that pulled darkness. On the second night, at approximately 0315, he became aware of something standing in the shallow depression. He sat with this part of the account for a long time before continuing. He said it was not the pale rock. He knew where the pale rock was. He said it was not atmospheric. He had seen atmospheric effects. He said that he looked at what he was looking at for a long time. He would not estimate how long, and that what he was looking at looked back. He used those words carefully. He said the figure was oriented toward him, that this was not an impression or a feeling, that it was observable the way that orientation between 2 people is always observable, because the human perceptual system is precisely calibrated to detect it. He did not challenge. He had thought, before standing that post, that if he saw what his soldiers had been seeing, he would challenge it, establish whether it was a person, do the things the situation called for. He did not. He said the decision not to challenge was not fear in any form he recognized from combat. He had been afraid in combat. He knew what that felt like. This was not that. Challenging seemed, he paused, beside the point. The normal operational logic governing what you do when you see a figure at 200 meters simply did not apply. He cannot account for the next interval precisely. He believes it was between 15 and 25 minutes. His memory of it is not blank. It is simply not organized the way memory usually is. He remembers being cold. He remembers the sound of wind moving across the top of the outpost wall behind him. He remembers looking at the depression and the figure being in it, and then looking at the depression and the figure not being in it, and not being able to locate the moment of transition. He was certain he had not looked away. He completed the watch. He signed the post log. The entry is standard. He stood that post 4 more times over the following 3 weeks. He saw the figure on 2 of those occasions. Each time, the experience was structurally the same. Each time, he recorded nothing. When his unit rotated out, he did not mention it to the incoming unit during the overlap period. He said he considered it. He is not entirely sure why he did not. What has stayed with him, more than the figure itself, is the quality of the looking. Most things you observe in the field, you observe. You gather information. You assess. You move on. Standing at that post, he did not have the feeling of being the one who was observing. He said it felt like the other direction. He does not know what that means. He has not found a way to make it mean anything satisfactory. There is a question that runs through every account examined here, and it is not a question about what the figure was. The people who saw it, soldiers trained to observe, trained to report, trained to act, chose, nearly without exception, not to report it. They signed their logs. They handed over their posts. They went about their duties. Memory is a strange repository for experiences that do not fit. The mind tends to store them carefully in specific places and to access them rarely. Veterans who described these experiences often noted they had not thought about them for years before being asked. And then, when the account was given, it was given with a precision that suggested the memory had not faded, only been set aside. The desert does not change between one unit's occupancy and the next. The rock formations are where they are. The depressions in the ground are where they are. Only the people watching them change, cycling through on rotation schedules, standing their posts, going home. The outposts themselves are mostly gone now, dismantled or abandoned as operational priorities shifted. The ground where they stood has returned to what it was before they were built. One veteran said he thought that whatever is out there, and he offered no definition of that phrase, has been there longer than any of the wars, longer than the roads and the outposts and the operational boundaries. That the wars were simply occasions for people to be in certain places at certain hours, awake and paying attention. He said he didn't think it was looking for them specifically. He said he thought it was just there. And the watches end. The soldiers come home, and they are quiet about certain things, and the nights in the desert continue without them, cold and open and occupied, perhaps, by whatever stands at the edge of what can be explained and does not move, and does not speak, and simply remains. If you want the most shocking story, watch the next video.